Welcome to the new season of Survive and Thrive, where we explore the challenges of independent public interest media in an era of turbulence. I'm your host, Janelle Dumalaon. Around the world, free media are fighting on multiple fronts: repression, censorship, shrinking funds, competition from digital platforms, and a deepening loss of public trust. I'm sure there's more. Last season, we focused on individual outlets, how they endured, and what lessons they offered. This season, we zoom out. What will it take for us to survive and thrive collectively in a world that keeps testing journalism's resilience and relevance as a cornerstone of democracy? And that brings us to today's episode. Big tech has already upended traditional media models. With AI, that disruption is only accelerating. So can an ecosystem where big tech does not squeeze out all the profits be created? How would that look like? My guest today is Paul McNally, founding director of DevelopAI, a consultancy teaching newsrooms how to use AI. Welcome, Paul. How are you today?
I'm great. Thanks very much for having me here.
Paul, let's start from the beginning. Public interest media, especially in the global south, but basically anywhere, they've had a hard time being viable, generating their own revenue to finance their journalism that was already happening in this age of social media. Why is that, and how has AI changed that picture further?
Well, I think it's fascinating that we've had a sequence with AI now where we have been excited about it, and now we're starting to slowly get sick of it, especially in the social media landscape, just as consumers. And I think journalists have been, interesting relationships around putting their content on social media for 15, 20 years now. And I actually think AI is creating something of a reckoning around, do journalists want to put their time and effort into producing content for these other platforms? Like, we've always felt a little bit conflicted about it. So I think AI is creating a sort of an inflection point where journalists can decide, like, do we want to go all in on this? Do we want to create more AI generate? The biggest request I get from newsrooms around the world is they don't want to create their own social media content. They want to create a 3,000 word article, and they want an AI process to chunk it up and put it on social media. And I think if you speak to people that are good at social media and they have good followings, that is the opposite of how they interact and how they build a following, right? You speak to influencers, you speak to these people that post all the time. They are not just giving it over to an AI process necessarily and just not thinking about the content that they're producing. And I think journalists, as a generalization, have not felt comfortable or really interested in creating content for social, and they're hoping AI will help them with that. But actually, I think it's going to do the reverse. I think it's not going to create content that is engaging or that people want. And I think the platforms also run a risk of, if this content becomes too widespread on somewhere like LinkedIn or Twitter or Facebook, then people might just turn off and not even come back.
It sounds like what you're saying is that social media outlets never really found a way to make the age of social media really profitable for them. And it really does sound like AI is set to make things worse in that vein. So is that right? Is that correct to say?
Well, if they keep going down the same path, like, I think with a lot of these things, if we keep doing the same thing, like, I wrote something for my newsletter a few weeks ago around media literacy, and it isn't that I'm anti-media literacy, and I think it's very important in the age of AI, but if we keep doing media literacy in the same way as we have been doing it, I don't think it will work. And I think if we approach producing content for social media in the same way, in the age of AI, that will also not work. So I think and each kind of aspect of production for journalists is going to take not just a tweak, but maybe a revamping or a complete change of how we operate.
Again?
Yes, exactly. Well, that's it. I think people also, if you're in a big newsroom, you feel completely burnt, like traumatized by the fact that, didn't we just do all this like 5 years ago? Didn't we do this 10 years ago? Like,
I thought we were still doing it.
Yeah, exactly. And I think journalists by design are often, and me included, are people that just like systems, and they like to learn that system, and then they like to stick with it. And I think they want to learn new topics and do new stories and accelerate their brains in that way. But in terms of how they operate, I don't think they're really innovative. I don't think the industry is by design. And I don't think a lot of journalists are, like hardcore journalists are. And I think the interesting part about this is those journalists, the good investigative journalists, are being pushed into a place where they're not comfortable. And I think, people that are more product related, people that are more interested in tech, people are more all that kind of stuff, they are kind of rising up. And you want to still nurture these hardcore journalists. The thing I worry about now is with all these new tools and stuff that I teach newsrooms to do, people that I'm encouraging to do, you don't want to lose the enthusiasm of your hardcore investigative journalists, because they are working every night, they are working every weekend. And if you lose them, you're going to lose an insanely good resource to uncover corruption and do all the good things that we actually want to happen in journalism.
Yes, I mean, this is what we're talking about, right? How do we keep fulfilling this democratic function? So there was one thing that I want, just regarding the work that we do, there are some really obvious ways that AI and big tech have made life harder or less financially secure for media outlets. Say you're a user, you want to look up an article, you get an AI summary from Google. Users stop clicking through the news websites where that information actually came from, perhaps that really good piece of investigative journalism you were talking about. So can you elaborate a bit on this problem and whether there are solutions to be had there?
Yeah, I mean, I gave a talk actually the other day for UNESCO around this, and sort of the death of the web, right? That has sort of been the buzz phrase, and it's been kicking around, I'd say, for about a year now. But it's only now, and I think you're right, with those Gemini, Google rewrites that happen now, that really alerted to everyone, like, this is a problem. If your business model is about people going to your website, then they're not going to go there if they can just get it from Gemini straight off the search. We are so focused now with doing the job that we're doing today better and faster with these AI tools. And that's just not going to be enough. On the one side, we are scared of being scraped by LLMs and kind of losing all our content without being compensated for it. And I think that's valid, right? And the BBC have released big studies around how inaccurate these scrapings are when they're sourcing their own BBC material. Right? They found an astounding amount of quotes and sources, even when the topic is the same. So you might look up something in ChatGPT, it'll say, this was written in the BBC. But actually, when you click through, the article is about that topic, but the quote isn't even there. The quote is entirely made up, right?
This hallucination, yes.
Exactly, but not to the extent that it will pass a courtesy check. So you'll be like, oh yeah, the BBC did write about that topic. Cool, I'm sure it's all fine. But actually, the truth, if you go a little bit deeper, it's full of mistakes. So I think we are at this point where we don't necessarily even want to do a deal now with the LLMs or the big tech companies producing them. People like News Corp, The Atlantic was a big get for OpenAI, I think, when they did a multi-million-dollar deal. And they've made, I guess, good immediate money from that. But for the rest of us, there is a kind of feeling that, are we going to have to pull people away into a different space? Or are we going to have to not think about like casual traffic? The way I kind of often think about a news website is that they've got their loyal readers, and we got very intoxicated with the idea of newsletters a few years ago. I sang the praises of newsletters and went to workshops about it and got very into this idea of building a relationship with the audience. And to some extent, that was entirely true. But I think the thing that wasn't as true is that not everyone can monetize their newsletter, right? We can all have newsletters and we can build this connection, but the conversion rate of financial security from your newsletter is only for a few. It's not for everyone. So that didn't quite work as much as people wanted. But the thing that I think we can take from that is this connection with your audience that we've always been talking about. And I think AI is going to absolutely accelerate that, in the fact that if you get, say, 50% of your audience to your website from people that love you and come to your website every day, and 50% from people just Google searching if there is a protest or a strike in your city, that other 50% is going to vanish largely. And I think that is going to be the short-term effect, and we need to think about that as quickly as possible. So that's not really a solution, but it's also kind of knowing that, like, the only audience you're going to have going forward are people that are coming directly to you for what they are trying to find. And they're not doing a kind of courtesy search through Facebook or anything else anymore.
So essentially, and I don't know, maybe I can't help but think in these old media, old
Yeah, me
internet
too.
ways. But essentially, what you're saying is that you need to find a way for users to bookmark your page instead of Googling to find you because they won't click through. Is that what you're saying?
Exactly. And I mean, I know that sounds very, like old school and very basic. Even the smallest digital platform is now going to realize that no one else is coming, right? Because, the thing that I think about is how engaged you are with an LLM when you're chatting to it, right? There's been a lot this week around inappropriate relationships with teenagers. Meta is being sued for that, character AI. I think it's something that if you are over 40, like I am, it's a little bit hard to understand. But this idea that people are having full on relationships with an LLM is something that is going to keep growing in the media and in the sort of younger generation. And I think when you think about news consumption, that is the absolute opposite of a Google search, where you search for things, it gives you 10 items that you can choose from, and then you go to those websites. With an LLM, you're chatting to it, even if you're debating a topic or whatever it is. And the idea that you're going to click out and read a static website is the complete opposite. It's like no one is going to want to do that. And I think there is probably a reality where without clicking out, you get money just to be talked about in the conversation as a news website. I think there is probably something like that. There's probably some kind of agreement that, already if you get scraped or if you give your data, there is a financial incentive. But the trouble is those payouts have, first of all, been very few for, or if any, for like Africa, for example. And I think the bigger sites are getting sort of paydays, and they're kind of motivated by the fact that they're getting some money now because they worry that if they wait 5 years, there'll be no money. So it's not a sustainable business model in any way.
Are news outlets, big and small alike, but the ones with the resource to do this would of course be the bigger ones. Are they all going to need to be like ChatGPT, like Perplexity?
I think that there is a feeling that everyone should have a chatbot, right? And I think that's fine for people to do that. I mean, anyone that has sort of thought about that more in terms of a business sense will realize there is no business model there. So you're not getting any kind of financial incentive. So it is really like a cherry on the top of the cake kind of situation where maybe you have subscribers and you're like, okay, you can have this chatbot for free, and now you can chat to our chatbot, which has access to our archive, and et cetera, et cetera. I mean, Politico came quite early out the gate and offered an absolutely outrageous subscription to their subscribers, where you could use a chatbot that was linked to their archive. And the idea wasn't just to ask it questions about the news, but to help you with your job, right? So to help you write political PR statements. And then within 6 months, it kind of came out that it was absolutely hallucinating at the worst possible rate. Like basically a product department had put this into and published this. And the trouble with that is it was also referencing journalism that they had created, because actually the way that was exposed was from their own journalists who were like, we don't like this. This is exposing our journalism as being incorrect, when actually if you scaled back, kind of like to my previous example, if you scaled back to the actual clicks, the journalism was fine, but the way it was referencing it wasn't. And that was a paid subscription perk for like thousands of dollars a year. So I think we are a little bit far away from being able to do that confidently. On the other hand, I think we also don't think about how people want to consume news. They don't necessarily want to sit there chatting relentlessly all the time for this. People also just want to watch something. Like YouTube still grows every quarter it is the juggernaut of the media landscape in the world. If you look at the landscape of media consumption, like YouTube is the winner, right? It won. And a lot of people use YouTube every day just for their news. So I think, and that is a relatively passive platform. So there's comments, but it's not like I think Google will eventually release something where they have talked about how they're going to release something where you chat to the video and you do that. But how much people really want to do that 8 hours a day rather than just watch something is also debatable, right? We also, we have been trained for decades to be passive, and maybe we enjoy that sometimes.
Sure. I mean, it is easy. I want to go back to one of the points that you were making about outlets working with or pushing back against big AI companies. So obviously, you have this issue where they train their models on media content on the web, and then the media outlets themselves lose traffic. So there is this talk, right, of the three L's and pushing back against AI companies: legislation, licensing, and litigation. So you have the likes of big outlets like the New York Times suing OpenAI. But of course, we have an entire spectrum in media. We also have smaller outlets, say in the global south, that have less leverage, less resources. Where does all of this leave them?
The smaller outlets in Africa are sort of left, in my experience, wondering if there's any money in this. They're sort of sitting there, they've seen the big deals, and they are aware of the ethical considerations, they're aware of everything, but they're also thinking, is there going to be a payout for any organizations on the continent as well, right? So, I think that is keeping people interested, keeping people from like talking out as much as maybe they should. I mean, I'm actually speaking at the M20 next week in Johannesburg around AI and media. And luckily, there is this growing swell of small organizations really wanting to kind of bandy together and work on the legislative side, right? It's quite encouraging. People are really trying to figure out a model that they can take, to put laws in place which will protect people, not just from a disinformation point of view, not from just a harm point of view, but also to protect journalism and their business models. So there are things happening in Africa for newsrooms of all shapes and sizes at a higher level. I think if you are a small organization and you're not connected to that advocacy, I think you're left a little bit in the wind and you're not quite sure where you should go. Like, I think you want to be ethical and you're aware that your audience wants you to be ethical. But I think a small news outlet is conflicted because where the money is often coming from is from Microsoft. It is from Google News Initiative. There are a huge multi-million dollar grant has just been released for African newsrooms by Google that's rolling out in community media just this week. And I think you want that money. You need that money to survive. And I think I often think when I talk about ethics, like ethics is a resource game in some ways. The more resources you have, the more like you're in a luxurious position to be more ethical. It's like eating well or being more environmentally friendly. You can get very wrapped up in it as an ethical issue, but it's also a resource issue. And I think it's the same for news in some extent. So there is not a newsroom that I've ever come across that wouldn't want to take that route, but they also are aware that there's cash on the table from these big tech companies that could transform their businesses.
So let's pretend you have this golden green fielding opportunity, right? Where you could create sort of a profitable newsroom from scratch that's also fit for this age of AI. How would that
Yeah.
How would that look like? I feel like I should be paying you for that insight.
But yeah, you want to solve media now in the next 2 minutes. Yeah.
So I want you to do it.
Yeah. So if we take, say, South Africa as an example, where I'm based at the moment, the capacity for people to pay for news here is so low, right? The major news platform, News 24, they charge like barely $5 a month, and you get access to a huge amount of content and news for that, right? And everyone else that's tried to paywall anything in any regard hasn't really succeeded to any extent. So I think if you're talking about like a fantasy operation, the idea of charging your audience, even in a Substack model, even in any kind of direction, I don't think would be the way to go. And I think from what we've seen in terms of Trump's sort of proclivities, the idea of being donor funded does work, like for a lot of newsrooms, especially if you're in exile. Like I'm busy coaching a whole bunch of newsrooms for Thomson Reuters who are in exile from Russia and Belarus, and they are all donor funded. I think it's naive to say you have to always get away from donor funding entirely, because that does exist and it will continue to exist, especially if you're a newsroom in exile or you've got safety issues. But I think you can realistically say it's not going to exist for everyone, depending on the work that you're doing. I think the way that you would think about your business model in terms of not relying on those two things, I think advertising can still work, but I think you will have to pull away from the traditional models on Facebook and Google. And I think that's going to take years of training the audience of where they go for news. When I think about social media, and not to keep going back to the past, but when I think about social media, is that the news outlets were complicit with training people to use these social platforms, right? We did it too. We helped them do that, right? We advertised Facebook as a little icon on every news outlet in the world. And that was just free advertising for this big platform that we did for years because we wanted them to go to our Facebook page. And I think we will still do that, I think, as a community. But I think if you were going to think about blue sky thinking, you would not do that. You would try and pull away and make something as a community. If you think about like the media development community, they could probably get together and think about like a platform where people put news and people could go to that for news. And that would be like a training exercise. You'd have to train your audience to know that that's where they go for news, like globally. Like, you know, a social media platform for news could be something that exists if it was communally owned by all the top 6 to 10 media development organizations. You know, we can't keep playing to these people and advertising for them and doing that. And I think I think you should take the money if you can get some money out of any of these people. But I think the idea that they're going to be there for us in 5 years just because they scraped our content and people might see a random link to you in a chat with an LLM, I don't think that's a path to profitability at all.
Now, taking that vision that you described, what kind of regulatory environment has to exist to bring that into being?
I mean, I guess personally, I'm very pro-regulation. I think there's good from that. I think what we've seen with the EU Act, with the AI Act, is that, you know, you could debate certain parts of that legislation as being good or bad. And, you know, but at the same time, I think the failing of it isn't really its fault. It's the fact that it's not global. And there's these technologies and these platforms are all global. So I think, you know, regulation is necessary. And I think the failure with big tech and media was the lack of regulation, right? Like even with the monopoly stuff, the fact that we allowed like Meta, wasn't even called Meta, to buy all those other apps and just grow them into this huge monopoly and then try and break them up after the fact, which obviously they refused to do, I think is a regulation issue. And that's clear. I think the trouble is that the ability to get the world to all work together hasn't really ever worked for anything. So, but I think when it comes to tech and the internet, you can or should try and do that. I think, you know, self-regulation, if you think about Africa in terms of the media, where there is, you know, regulation for media is often used against people, right? So, you know, you often find in countries where they've created laws about hate speech that are supposed to protect people, governments twist those around and push them against journalists of like, you are using hate speech, and they'll try and imprison them based on that. So I'm also not oblivious to the fact that regulation can be turned on its head, you know, and can kind of work against you. And that kind of leans me often to this idea of like not doing it at a like sort of a legal level, but at a self-regulation level. I think the most successful sort of press codes, the most successful sort of adherence to laws for journalists haven't really been laws, right? They've been agreed on rules that, you know, huge amounts of media have agreed on, and they've kind of sold it to the audience of the people that are not adhering to these rules are bad journalists. And when I think about press codes example, like the audience has kind of lost that. They don't often know if they're part of a press code or what that even means, or if that's a good thing, or if they should even trust the press code. I mean, people are more suspicious now, right? So they're not sure if this press code that they're meant to be considering a good thing is actually a good thing. But I think around AI, in most workshops that I do, if you bring in a bunch of newsrooms from across Asia or across Africa, there is usually an end result where people are like, let's all bring up at least our editorial policies around AI together and start building that out into some sort of agreed idea of what we're doing. And I think it, you know, will take big organizations to do that, but that is the way to go, rather than, I think you need to work it on both sides, but I think we can control the self-regulation side, where the actual legislation side is more complicated.
I mean, just as an aside, I find it interesting that you said people are more suspicious now. Do you find that they're more suspicious or that they're more credulous? Because this is one of those issues that we talk about in terms of whether users can identify what is good information, what is bad information, and how AI could exacerbate that.
I think people are more suspicious, but to the point where they've had almost their trust in information shattered. And I think if you talk to news organizations, they take this shattering of truth and building truth very personally, right? They think about it in terms of them and their relationship with their audience member, and they've somehow failed, or this connection has been lost and it somehow needs to be rebuilt. But I think, and I think that's admirable to think of it like that. But I think you've got to also think about this person who's just consuming content from all sorts of directions. And as a result, they don't really trust anything. It's got nothing to do with you. It's like, it's not me, it's you kind of thing. And I think we need to kind of take people at that value to some extent. We've got to be like, okay, these people don't trust anything. Is this something we can fix in a person just by one news outlet when they might be coming into contact with 50 different outlets a day? Probably not.
So there was one more question that I had around regulation, and it has to do again with sort of the outlets that you have from the global south, and the fact that the big companies that sort of determine the shape of the internet, they're all in the U.S. Famously, right. Not the biggest proponents of regulation. What effect does that have on the ability to create regulation that would apply to everyone?
Yeah, I think when I speak to newsrooms, especially in Africa and Asia, they are always thinking about how they want to make something for them. There is a kind of pullback to this idea, not just with regulation, but even with the technology. And I think even from sort of 2022, because of social media, because of what happened, people are, okay, we don't want to be just giving money to these big corporations all in America. We need to build one for Africa. We need to build one for Asia. There seems to be that sentiment. And now if you spin on 3 years, people realize how much money, how much resource that really takes. There are obviously incredible startups that are doing amazing thing around languages and building language models. But the low-hanging fruit of that, well, it's still quite high, but the lower hanging fruit of that is the sense of building an API that can kind of plug in, that can help you with certain languages. And I think there's amazing work being done with that, and then newsrooms kind of utilizing that. But in terms of people creating almost like a walled garden for themselves away from the US, I think, yeah, it's not possible. And I think also, even if you wanted to do that, I think to your point around the regulation side, then that, say you could regulate everything in Africa and it would all work perfectly and it would be separate, that wouldn't help, right? Because on the one hand, you want it to be global. And on the other hand, what I've realized is because of the bias, right? There's still intense bias, which is pro white men on these LLMs. Like if you ask images for someone in authority, they will invariably give you a white man because it's scraped off the internet, and the internet is incredibly biased, not just towards English, but racially and according to gender as well. And it becomes so obvious when you're in a newsroom, say in Kenya, where I was a few weeks ago, and they are battling with that bias, but they are kind of having to live with it, right? They're sort of like, okay, we can't do that, but we're aware of it. And the thing that why you don't want that walled garden LLM, or you don't want that walled garden technology, is because the people that are not in, say, Africa, they won't even know that bias exists, right? The people in Kenya, they know the bias is there, and it might upset them, but they're able to navigate around it and figure out how to circumvent it. But like, if you let these things out just into Europe and the US with these biases that aren't being sort of made less biased by input from Africa and input from Asia, they will get worse. Without exception, I would say every African newsroom has had someone in there has thought like, we need to pull up the gates. We need to like become more insular. And invariably it's not possible financially, but I don't think it's good for the greater ecosystem, if you like.
So this has been fascinating, and we do have time for one user question, and it is this, Paul. If AI can already perform many newsroom tasks faster and cheaper, what real incentive do major media outlets have to keep investing in human journalists beyond protecting quality and trust? That is a question from Aaron Tungaraza from Tanzania.
I'm glad you asked this, because it is something that comes up quite a bit. And I think it comes to this sense of like, if you want to do things faster and cheaper, or if you want to do things better, right? And if you survey people, they will, in an open forum where they have to be seen, they will always say, I want to do things better, right? No one will ever choose the cheaper, quicker option if they're, but if they've got it on a secret ballot, they might say, actually, I just want to do this much cheaper and I want to do this quicker. But the truth of it is, why newsrooms can't do that is because they are ultimately competing with every single other digital person on the planet who also has access to all these tools, right? The gatekeeping around journalism and technology has, been going down for a long time, and it is now completely at ground zero. So if you're an outlet that just goes, okay, we'll just do everything cheaper and faster and fire half our staff, then you're not going to have an organization for very long, because you're competing with a guy on Instagram who's using all these AI tools, and actually probably making maybe very good content just on his own, right? So you need to think about, like, okay, we've got this many people, at least for the time being, we've got this many resources. How do we use these tools to make everything quicker and cheaper on the one side, but then also bolster the quality of the content in such an extravagant way that it blows away all these one-man shops? Because essentially, like, okay, with a reasonable amount of exceptions, influencers and people on YouTube, some of them have extensive teams, but a lot of them are just one-man shows, right? So I think it should be so obvious for a newsroom to understand that even if everyone's job has to change in your newsroom to some extent, you have to double down on producing much, much better content. And that idea of quality is debatable, but I think by and large, that can point to something that's new, right? The idea of old school journalism, of uncovering something. People still love corruption stories. People still love holding people to account. People love that stuff. It does work well in this environment. It has just become so prohibitively expensive. So hopefully you can use AI tools to help with those parts of your production and do more of them and kind of make, the world a better place.
Paul, I think you did it. I think you solved the media in the age of AI. Thank you very much.
It's a pleasure. Yeah, I'm glad. There's a lot of pressure, but I'm glad it worked.
Paul McNally, founding director of DevelopAI. And until next time on Survive and Thrive, your media viability podcast.
Thanks for listening to Survive and Thrive, the Media Viability Podcast. If you liked what you heard, please subscribe and make sure to hit like so that other listeners can find us as well. For feedback, send an email to dw-academy.surviveandthrive@dw.com. You can find all the information in the show notes.